July 2024. A gunman on a rooftop in Butler, Pennsylvania. Donald Trump turns his head at the last moment. The bullet grazes his ear instead of killing him. One attendee dies. 2 are critically wounded. Within hours, both parties issue statements condemning political violence. Within days, the coverage moves on. September 2024. A man lies in wait at Trump's golf course in Palm Beach, Florida. An AK-style weapon, discovered in the bushes before he can fire. Arrested. Both parties condemn political violence. The coverage moves on. April 25, 2026. Tomas Allen, 31, a Caltech-educated engineer turned teacher from Torrance, California, walks into the Washington Hilton with a shotgun, a handgun, and multiple knives. He charges the Secret Service checkpoint in the lobby while the White House Correspondents Dinner is underway in the ballroom. Trump, Melania, J.D. Vance, and dozens of cabinet officials are at the head table 40 meters away. One Secret Service agent is shot in the vest. Allen is tackled. Trump is evacuated. 3 attempts, 3 years, 3 rounds of bipartisan condemnation, 3 cycles of the same response, and then the coverage moves on. I want to talk today about why it moves on, and why, when it moves on, nothing structurally changes. And why? Because nothing structurally changes, the cycle repeats. Because what happened at the Washington Hilton on Saturday night is not primarily a story about one man with a shotgun. It is a story about the structural conditions that produced him. And those conditions are not unique to Cole Allen. They are measurable, they are documented, and they are getting worse, not better. Hit subscribe if you are learning something here. We have a lot of ground to cover today. Let me start with what the political science literature actually tells us about political violence. Because the mainstream coverage of events like Saturdays is almost always framed around the individual. Who was he? What did he believe? Was he mentally ill? Did he have a criminal record? Cole Allen was 31. He had no criminal record. He was educated at one of the most prestigious technical universities in the world. He told authorities he was targeting officials in the Trump administration. The individual framing is not wrong, but it is incomplete in a way that consistently prevents the analysis from reaching the structural level where the actual problem lives. Barbara Walter, a political scientist at UC San Diego and one of the world's leading scholars of civil conflict, published a book in 2022 called How Civil Wars Start. In it, she describes a set of measurable structural indicators that, when they move in the wrong direction simultaneously, predict escalating political violence. Not guarantee it, predict it. The indicators are not complicated. They are declining institutional trust, rising political polarization, the spread of ethnic or identity-based political parties, and the failure of elections to produce outcomes that the losing side accepts as legitimate. Walter and her colleagues at the Political Instability Task Force, the organization that advises American intelligence agencies on conflict risk in foreign countries, began applying their own analytical framework to the United States in 2020. What they found was uncomfortable. The United States was moving in the wrong direction on multiple indicators simultaneously. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, but measurably. Keep that framework in the back of your mind because we are coming back to it. The first structural force is what I call the polarization threshold. Political disagreement is normal. Every democracy has it. The question is not whether people disagree about policy. The question is whether political opponents are seen as legitimate rivals or as existential threats. The distinction matters because the psychology of threat is different from the psychology of disagreement. When someone believes their opponent is simply wrong about tax policy, they campaign harder. When someone believes their opponent represents an existential threat to their country, their family, or their identity, the calculus of violence changes. The research is consistent across multiple democracies and multiple historical periods. Political violence escalates not when disagreement is high, but when a critical mass of citizens begins to view the opposing side not as political opponents but as enemies of the nation. Germany in the early 1930s, Spain in the mid-1930s, the United States in the period leading up to 1861. The measurement tools that political scientists use to track this transition show American polarization has been accelerating since approximately 2010 and has entered territory not seen since the period immediately preceding the Civil War. Not in terms of policy disagreement, which has always existed, in terms of the percentage of Americans who describe the opposing party not as political rivals, but as a genuine threat to the country's existence. That number, measured by Pew Research and replicated by multiple independent surveys, crossed 50% for the first time in American history in 2022. As of 2025, it sits above 60% for both Republican and Democratic respondents. When the majority of Americans believe the other political party represents an existential threat, the population of individuals willing to consider violence as a response to that threat grows. Not to a majority, not to a large minority, but large enough in a country of 340 million people to produce a Cole Allen at a rate that is structurally predictable rather than individually surprising. The second structural force is the rhetoric to violence mechanism. And this is the dimension of the problem that both sides consistently refuse to fully acknowledge. Political rhetoric that frames the opposition as not merely wrong but as evil, as criminals, as enemies of the people, as traitors, as destroyers of the nation, changes the psychological barrier to violence for a specific population of listeners. Not for most people, for a small percentage of people who are already operating at the edge of that barrier. The same words that register as hyperbole for 95% of the audience function as permission for 5%. And in a country of 340 million, 5% of a radically small, already radicalized subset is still thousands of people. This mechanism is not a partisan observation. It operates on both sides of the American political divide and has operated on both sides throughout history. James Hodgkinson, who shot Steve Scalise at a congressional baseball practice in 2017, was a left-wing activist who had consumed years of increasingly extreme anti-Republican political content. Cole Allen told authorities he was targeting Trump administration officials. The mechanism does not distinguish between left and right. It responds to the intensity of the threat framing, not to its ideological direction. The historical parallel that most clearly illuminates this mechanism is not a foreign one. It is American. It is 1968. In 1968, the United States was experiencing a period of structural stress that bears uncomfortable similarity to the present moment. A deeply unpopular war that divided the country along generational and cultural lines. A president who had become a lightning rod for national rage. Economic anxiety concentrated in specific communities. A civil rights movement that had produced enormous progress but also enormous backlash. And a media environment, then as now, that amplified the most extreme voices because extreme voices generated the most attention. In that environment, in the space of 66 days, two of the most prominent political figures in the country were assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. in April, Robert F. Kennedy in June. Both killings were committed by individuals who were not members of organized terrorist groups. Both were committed by men who had consumed intense political content that framed their targets as obstacles to a cause of supreme importance. Both produced exactly the same response that Saturday's shooting produced. Bipartisan grief, calls for unity, demands that the violence stop. And then within weeks, the underlying structural conditions that produced the violence remained entirely unchanged. The year 1968 did not resolve the structural crisis. It continued into the 1970s with bombings by domestic political groups numbering in the hundreds annually. It subsided not because a speech or a law changed American political culture, but because the specific convergence of stressors, the Vietnam War ending, the civil rights legal framework being established, the economic cycle turning, gradually separated. Today's convergence of stressors has not begun to separate. The structural conditions are not improving, they are accumulating. Now I want to address the argument that is most commonly made after every incident like Saturday's, because it deserves a serious answer. The argument is this: Cole Allen was a lone wolf, a disturbed individual. His attack tells us nothing systematic about American political life. Most Americans on both left and right are fundamentally decent people who would never consider violence. The appropriate response is better mental health services, better security protocols, and to resist the urge to draw sweeping conclusions from the actions of one troubled person. Every element of that argument contains truth, and it completely misses the structural reality. Here is the reality. No student of political violence argues that most people in a radicalizing environment will commit violent acts. The literature does not make that claim. What the literature says is that in a population experiencing certain measurable structural stressors, the percentage of individuals who cross the threshold to violence is predictably higher than in a population not experiencing those stressors. The violence is not random. It is not evenly distributed across time and geography. It clusters in periods and places where the structural conditions are present. The lone wolf framing is analytically seductive because it allows both parties to avoid the uncomfortable conclusion that the rhetoric they have each employed contributes to the environment that produces lone wolves. It allows security experts to focus on tactical improvements, magnetometers, checkpoints, perimeter distances, rather than on the structural conditions that make those improvements necessary. And it allows the news cycle to move on, as it always does, because the structural story is slow, complex, and does not resolve in a 48-hour news window. Real people are the subject of this story. The Secret Service agent who took a shotgun blast to the vest and spent Saturday night in a hospital. The journalists who were in the ballroom when the shots were fired. The elected officials who, like Steve Scalise before them, are now doing the political calculation of whether their public presence creates an unacceptable risk for the people around them. These are not abstractions. They are the human cost of a structural problem that is being managed with tactical responses rather than addressed at the level where it actually lives. The third structural force is institutional trust collapse. And this is the mechanism that connects the polarization data to the individual act of violence in a way that makes the pattern predictable rather than random. Political violence is much less likely in societies where citizens believe that legitimate institutional channels exist for resolving their grievances. Courts, elections, legislatures, free press. When a citizen believes that the court will rule fairly, the election will be counted accurately, the legislature represents their interests, and the press reports honestly, the cost of political violence is enormous relative to the potential benefit. The system offers an alternative that might actually work. When a citizen loses confidence in all of those institutions simultaneously, when courts are seen as partisan, when elections are seen as rigged or stolen, when the legislature is seen as captured by special interests, when the press is seen as the enemy of the people, the calculus changes. Not for most citizens, for the small percentage who are already operating near the threshold. The data on American institutional trust tells a consistent story. Trust in Congress has been below 20% for most of the past 15 years. Trust in the Supreme Court has fallen more sharply since 2022 than in any comparable period in the history of modern polling. Trust in the mainstream media, measured across partisan lines, has collapsed. And confidence in the integrity of electoral results is now split along partisan lines in a way that would have been considered remarkable even a decade ago. Tomas Allen was educated, employed, and by all accounts functional in everyday life. He was not operating at the margins of society in the way that security threat assessments typically profile as high risk. He was operating in the mainstream of an information environment that, across multiple years, appears to have brought him to the conclusion that institutional channels were insufficient and that direct action against government officials was justified. That conclusion did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a specific information environment. And that information environment is not unique to Tomas Allen. It is shared in varying degrees of intensity by millions of Americans on both sides of the political divide. Now let me walk you through 4 things to watch in the coming weeks, because the structural consequences of Saturday's event extend well beyond the immediate security response. The first thing to watch is the motivational investigation. Federal investigators will spend weeks establishing the full picture of Tomas Allen's radicalization. What content did he consume? Who, if anyone, influenced him? What specific grievances drove him to the threshold? The motivational picture will be politically uncomfortable for someone. It always is. Watch whether the full findings are made public or whether they are quietly managed to minimize political damage. The management of that disclosure will tell you whether this incident is being treated as a structural problem or as a tactical one. The second thing to watch is the congressional response. After Butler, Congress held hearings on Secret Service failures. After Palm Beach, enhanced perimeter protocols were implemented. After Saturday, the response will again focus on the tactical dimension. Watch whether any elected official in either party initiates a serious bipartisan conversation about the structural conditions that produce the threat environment, as opposed to the security measures that manage it. If no one does, it will confirm that the political incentive structure discourages that conversation, because it requires each party to examine its own contribution to the problem. The third thing to watch is the rhetoric environment in the 30 days following the incident. Historical research on political violence shows that major incidents sometimes produce temporary de-escalation in the intensity of political rhetoric, As both sides absorb the shock of how close to catastrophe the country came, watch whether that de-escalation occurs and how long it lasts. If it evaporates within 2 weeks, which is what the 2024 Butler pattern suggested, the structural conditions that produce the violence will remain fully intact. The fourth thing to watch is the broader security environment for public officials. Several members of Congress have already hired private security beyond their government protection. Multiple journalists who cover the White House have updated their security protocols. The Washington Hilton incident will produce another round of threat reassessments across every institution that hosts events with senior government officials. Watch whether the cost of those security upgrades begins to structurally change the way public officials engage with the public, whether physical accessibility declines, whether public events become more fortress-like. That trajectory matters because reduced public accessibility itself feeds the structural grievance that contributes to the radicalization environment. The structural conclusion from all of this is not that America is on the verge of civil war. The structural conclusion is more specific and more actionable. The United States is experiencing a measurable deterioration in the structural conditions that historically precede sustained political violence. Not a collapse, a deterioration. The difference between a deterioration and a collapse is that a deterioration is reversible if the right interventions are made before the threshold is crossed. The interventions that would actually address the structural problem are known. They involve rebuilding institutional trust, reducing the intensity of existential political framing, creating deliberate spaces for cross-partisan engagement, and treating the information environment that produces radicalization as a structural problem rather than a free speech abstraction. None of those interventions are easy, none are quick. All of them require political actors to voluntarily reduce the rhetorical intensity that produces short-term political advantage. The cycle continues not because no one knows how to break it. The cycle continues because the incentive structure of American politics makes breaking it costly for every individual actor, even when everyone can see that continuing it is catastrophic for the system as a whole. This is not prophecy. This is structural history combined with game theory. I might be wrong about whether the current moment produces a genuine, sustained de-escalation of political rhetoric following the Washington Hilton incident. I might be wrong about whether the institutional trust collapse stabilizes or continues to deepen. If I am wrong, we will come back and analyze why. Save this analysis. Come back in 90 days. Check whether the bipartisan statements of condemnation produced any change in the rhetoric environment. Check whether Congress held substantive hearings on the structural conditions rather than just the security failures. Check whether the next incident has already happened. The answers will tell you whether Saturday night was a turning point or another data point in an accelerating trend. Subscribe if you want to follow this analysis as it develops. Because the story of political violence in America is not a story about individual bad actors. It is a story about structural conditions. And structural conditions do not resolve themselves.